Hi there. Welcome. I'm Bob Thompson, and I'd like to welcome you to the Philanthropic Planner program. We put this on once a month, and occasionally we have a guest, but today we don't have a guest, so you just have to put up with me. Philanthropic Planner. Why produce this kind of program? It's really to have kind of a friendly dialogue, if you will, about philanthropy and the importance of philanthropy to the community, and to talk about things that we kind of take for granted. Charities, the needs for charity, the demand, greater demand by charities, and the other side, kind of the development officers on one side representing the charities and raising money, or the planners on the other side, attorneys, accountants, financial planners, and so on. And you and me, the donor, the philanthropist, which is another reason to produce this. You don't have to be a multi-millionaire to be a philanthropist. Philanthropy comes, if we use the term caritas, love for all, caritas, giving back to the community, having some significance either during life or at death. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we don't want to talk about legalese. We want to simplify the complexity. We want to share with you what others are doing in a similar situation. How do they approach this subject of philanthropy in their daily lives, their planning? We talk about maybe social capital. Social capital meaning the difference between kind of a involuntary tax or mandatory tax versus a voluntary tax. I had a gentleman say, you mean rather than me being taxed at $10,000, I can gift the $10,000 and have it go where I want it to go? So there are a lot of reasons to put on this program. I think we're approaching the 100th program over the last 9 years. So welcome. Those of you who have been here before, you kind of know that the first 5 or 10 minutes is just to talk about what you heard, the importance to the community, to the region, the state, the country, and globally. A lot of philanthropy today is directed to special interests that you and I may have in other parts of the world, or locally to the local food bank or what have you. So once again, welcome. We're glad to see you join us this time. Congratulations are in order. Last program, last month was about capacity, and we talk about capacity where people will say, Bob, I'd like to give more if I could. I'd like to give more if I knew how. Well, if I could simply says, hey, do I have the capacity? Am I able to gift the way you're suggesting without jeopardizing my future, my family's future, spouse? Do I have the capacity? And that comes in a couple of different forms. Usually the time horizon that we're talking about is capacity to gift annually, or the capacity to gift large amounts during life, or in the form of a bequest. So I would like to do more if I could is capacity. Well, last month's program about capacity, we were talking about Cleveland Clinic and an old friend of mine that needed a transplant, and a young man, Ted Engel, was willing to participate as a donor in a liver transplant to Doug Cowan. And the congratulations that I mentioned is that we had over 700 responses, 764 responses, as a matter of fact. Well, actually, it was 7. We had 7 responses. But in addition to my wife and one of my children, having 7 is a great cause for celebration for this crazy program. Interestingly enough, of the 7, I eliminate 2 for my wife and daughter. Two of the seven was interesting. We had a gentleman who said, I had a serious operation at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, and the other gentleman did his residency. A doctor here in the Farmington Valley did his residency at the Cleveland Clinic. So two, interestingly enough, saw the end of the program, Cleveland Clinic, and our theme for that program was capacity. Another lady of the seven talked about increasing her bequest and directing it to a local hospital. Her husband died here a few years ago, and she caught part of the program, I think from the middle on to the end, and saw the Cleveland Clinic, saw the wonderful things that this transplant story entailed, and she called her attorney and changed her will, her bequest, to a percentage. And instead of $5,000 a number of years ago, 13, 14, 15 years ago, from $5,000 to 5% of her estate. So she has directed in her, I think it was a codicil to her will, she's directed her executor to direct 5% of her estate to various charities, but in particular a local hospital. So welcome again, and really it was only seven, not 764, but I thought I'd share that with you. This week, this month's program, this taping, we have titled Trends and Challenges. It's no picnic for philanthropic planning and no walk in the park. And what do we mean by that? I want to share with you some of the trends that we're observing in the philanthropic area and the challenges as we look at those trends. A lot of studies are ongoing. The Pew Foundation does a lot of philanthropic study. Bank of America annually does a big survey. The School of Philanthropy out in Indianapolis, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, they ongoing as a part of their curriculum do studies. But what kind of trends are we looking at? Over the last 3 or 4 programs, I've talked about the effects of the recession and how for a long period of time charities have struggled through that. Well, let me share with you, in 2007, we looked at charity and the giving in that year of $358 billion with a B, $358 billion gifted in 2007. Well, 2007, 8, and 9, that dropped by 14%. 14% in a short period of time, down to $303 billion. Now, when you're talking billions, you kind of say, wow, $303 billion is a lot of money, but the drop from almost $360 billion, $358 billion, down to $303, that's an incredible drop. Well, some of these surveys and studies that have come out recently, in the last few months especially, looking at 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, a 5-year period, the biggest rebound in charitable giving going back to pre-1940. That's a huge jump. And coincidentally, ironically, where we finished up at the end of 2014 was $358 billion. Now, from 2007 to 2014, we have the same figure for that year, $358 billion. So it's taken a long time, and the charities struggled during that period of time. They are still looking at the after effects of the recession. In many cases, charities either went away, they reduced, instead of going away, reduced their staff dramatically. They held back and couldn't invest in technology, which they needed. They consolidated positions and responsibilities in the development office, where instead of 3 or 4 different responsibilities in offices, maybe one person or 2 people wearing different hats at different times to raise monies. So let's look at some of these trends. The trends I'd like to share with you are maybe 8 or 10 of them, but let me quickly go through those. And again, keep in mind this 2007 to 2014. It took us 5 years to get back to ground zero. Last year, 2014, the breakdown, individuals, their giving went up 4% last year. In bequests, up 14%. And of that individual giving increase of 4% and bequests increase of 4% for individual giving and 14% for bequests. The total from individuals, the total giving represents about 80% of the entire philanthropic pie. Now, that's significant, that's impressive, but each one of these items, I say trends, we look at the trend, but what are the challenges? Well, on the individual basis, the challenge is that 80% of the pie is down from 87% not that long ago, 87% back in the 90s. Well, that's just like the 303 billion. That drop from 87% of the total philanthropic pie down to 80%. And if we continue on that trend, what are the challenges that face us? And that's part of the reason we want to talk about it today. Incomes are up. Discretionary income this last year is up over 3%. But of that 3% increase in discretionary income, kind of a flat impact or result on the charitable side. So we see even in a slow economy, slow growth, slow in incomes growing and so on, but an increase of almost 3.5%. And what's the impact on charitable giving? Well, part of the reason that some of the experts are hypothecating or assuming is that we have this incredible student debt. We have other debt individually. We have increases in taxes in various ways, various taxes. So even though the discretionary income is up, the fear and the demands of the individual dramatically impact. So what's the challenges coming out of that trend? We just have to monitor that and keep up to date on it. Foundations represent about 15% of total giving. And last year, grants were up 3.5%, and that's good. The trend there is an increase in foundation giving. The challenge is that donors over this short period of time are giving less to foundations. Now, what I don't know and what I can't decipher from some of this material is the impact of donor-advised funds. Well, there is an impact there with respect to foundations, but donor-advised funds are kind of the poor man's foundation. So we kind of have to look at that foundation. But the significant part of this is that foundation giving is 15% of the total pie. Keep that in mind. Corporate giving. Corporate giving also up last year, 12%. Now, that's an impressive increase. And 56, a nonprofit foundation, finance foundation, says that 56% of large corporations, of 250 or 300 of the largest U.S. corporations, 56% have increased their corporate giving over the last 2 or 3 years. That's a trend that we'd like to see, but the challenge is that we look at pre-tax pre-tax figures for corporations and the corresponding giving is down. So if we look at since 1984, we look at 1.5% of pre-tax profits at 1.5% 28 years ago. And today that is 0.7%. So as these corporations get bigger and their pre-tax profit is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the corresponding figure of corporate giving has not paralleled that figure, 0.7 versus 1.5. So of the corporate share of the pie, remember foundations are 15% and individuals either living gifts or bequests represent 80%. Corporate giving is only 5% of the pie. So the trend is recently that large corporations are giving more, but how does that keep up with their pre-tax profits? And still only 5% of the total part of the pie. The wealthy are giving more. Their giving is bigger and bigger, and we see that in the size of these gifts. I mentioned donor advised funds. $1 million gifts from donor advised funds, not foundations, but donor advised funds, over $272 million gifts out of donor advised funds versus 185 the year before in 2013. So a substantial increase of over $101 million gifts from donor advised funds. The wealthy are giving more. The affluence is ever increasing, and we criticize some of that. We want to tax them more, or some people want to tax them more. But the giving from the wealthy continues to grow, and we see that that's a part of the individual giving. Okay, so the challenge is how do we, during life, in addition to bequests, but how can we address and address that challenge as far as the wealthy are concerned? One of the challenges as far as the wealthy gifts, the larger gifts, is that 30% of all of the gifting to colleges and universities, 30% of roughly $39 billion went to only 20 colleges and universities. So is that something that we should be concerned with? I think that's a challenge, that between 10 and $12 billion directed only to 20 institutions. And we hear, and we talked about it several programs ago, how some colleges, even some that are 125, 140 years old, may be closing up and closing their doors. So there are challenges there that we need to not only recognize, but we need to look at solutions if there are solutions, and hopefully there are several to choose from. Social services, the gifting social services is up 2% in 2014. And remember the 5-year recovery that we have from the recession. But social services, we have another survey that says of 5,000 charities, more than half of that 5,000 were unable to meet the demand for food, shelter, and other basic needs out there in the charitable world. So in the social services and religious areas, we, as I mentioned, education is number one. Religious is number one, and education is number two. It represents a little more than half of the entire philanthropic pie. Arts and animal giving, we see that there are more personal interest giving to causes, and dog rescue, for example, and some of these things has grown. But as we see that grow, we see a lesser giving to other areas. There are only so many dollars out there. So one of the challenges is to increase that $358 billion so that we have this filtering to more causes. So in review, individuals, a total of 80%. We've got 72% what we call living gifts, and 8% in bequests. Foundations 15%, and corporations 5%. So there are a lot of challenges out there. We look at areas. I've mentioned a friend of mine, Dr. Steve Myers, and a couple of his books, but personalized philanthropy. If we look at some of these challenges that we have, and we share with others what some people are doing successfully in personalizing their philanthropy, and either development or advisors being innovative in not only how they put together these strategies and so on, but how it's communicated to donors. And the communication aspect of it is taking innovative ideas and communicating that in such a way. And I'm making a presentation in the future, and perhaps I'll come back and have it as a program here for the Philanthropic Planner, but I'm calling it the three-legged ladder, where we're talking about two forms of annuities and a donor advised fund, and working these three legs and laddering each leg of this three-legged ladder. It's an interesting concept. When we do the number crunching, when we do the math, it's exciting. We had a gentleman in the office here a couple of weeks ago, just recently, and single gentleman, 69 years old, still actively working, but planning to semi-retire. He says he wants to work part-time, 1 or 2 days a week, but his concern is, and it sounds like the tax tail is wagging the dog here a little bit, but he's concerned about this income. He's going to have access and have income greater than when he's working. He has a large 401k. He has a large deferred annuity. He has deferred his Social Security to age 70. So we have this required minimum distribution from the IRA rollover. We have, and he's going to be receiving a substantial amount of income, and he's concerned about taxation. Well, when we apply the concepts of this three-legged ladder, he can, without jeopardizing his future as far as health care costs and so on, he can even increase his income even more. But philanthropically, we looked at just one of the three legs of this ladder, and he was amazed that he could receive 7.1% lifetime income. You can't outlive that 7.1%. And get a charitable deduction versus this idle money over here that's making 0.01 or 0.02 in what I call idle money. Well, he was amazed that he could increase and get 7% out of that and still get a tax deduction from one of these legs of the ladder. So what we're looking at is trying to communicate and address some of these challenges that we're talking about. And when we look at bequests, and we look at the lady that responded, one of the 7 that said she watched part of our program last month, and saying, wow, just making a small change in a will or a living trust, and rather than a dollar amount, increasing it to a percent, and in her case, 5%. Now, when we look at capacity, like we did last last month. When we look at, I would like to do more if I could. Well, that's capacity. And when we look at increasing and having a guarantee of lifetime income and taking the pressure and the angst off of what happens tomorrow, less than that, we do recognize the capacity, increased capacity, and increasing gifts. And remember, in most of our giving, the advice is don't write out a check when you're doing this. And what that means is if I'm responding to a solicitation by a development officer and I want to make a gift of $10,000, maybe a capital campaign or something like that, it's better for me to give an appreciated position like a mutual fund or a stock position, and I have let's say $3,000 of cost. My cost basis is $3,000. I have $7,000 of appreciated stock or fund, and it's easier for me to gift that and get a tax deduction when you look at some of the rumblings out there that we have proposal to maybe double the capital gains rate. Well, think about the efficiency of that gift rather than writing out a check for $1,000 or $10,000, excuse me. So the trends are there when we talk about giving, foundations, corporate donors on an individual basis. But what are the challenges? The challenges are great. We see some movement and trends in there, and we have to recognize not only the challenges, but what are some of the solutions. Now, the good news is it's very hot today, and it's subject to very hot tomorrow. The better news is it's not snowing. And remember, philanthropic planning is no picnic, and it's not a walk in the park. So until the next time, we'll see you.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.